November 13th, 1942. The waters off Guadalcanal churned black and forbidding under a moonless sky, visibility reduced to mere meters as tropical rainstorms swept across Iron Bottom Sound. Commander Hideo Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Kinugasa, straining his eyes into the darkness, confident that his night-trained lookouts would spot any enemy vessels long before American radar could penetrate the storm. He believed, as did every officer in the Imperial Japanese Navy, that superior night-fighting doctrine and years of rigorous training had made them masters of nocturnal naval combat. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded that night would shatter the illusion of Japanese naval superiority and reveal a technological revolution that would fundamentally transform naval warfare forever. The men who survived would return to their admirals with reports so shocking that many would initially refuse to believe them. The Japanese combined fleet had entered the conflict with what military analysts considered the finest night-fighting capability of any navy in history. For over a decade, the Imperial Japanese Navy had invested tremendous resources into perfecting nocturnal combat techniques. Every evening, lookouts underwent intensive training, spending hours in darkened rooms to maximize their night vision capabilities. The standard practice required lookouts to avoid any exposure to bright light for at least 30 minutes before assuming watch duties. Some dedicated individuals went so far as to wear red-tinted goggles throughout the day, believing this enhanced their ability to see in darkness. Lieutenant Commander Tameichi Hara, serving aboard the destroyer Shigure, had written extensively in his personal journal about these training methods. He described exercises where crews would identify ship silhouettes at distances exceeding 10,000 meters on nights with minimal ambient light. The Navy's confidence was not unfounded. In early engagements near the Solomon Islands, Japanese forces had repeatedly surprised Allied vessels, delivering devastating torpedo attacks before opponents even realized enemy ships were present. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed another advantage that naval planners considered decisive. Their Type 93 torpedo, known to the Allies as the Long Lance, represented the pinnacle of torpedo technology. These weapons ran on pure oxygen rather than compressed air, leaving virtually no visible wake. With a warhead containing over 1,000 pounds of explosive and an effective range exceeding 40,000 meters, these torpedoes could deliver catastrophic damage from distances Allied commanders thought impossible. Commander Yamamoto had personally witnessed the effectiveness of these tactics during the Battle of Savo Island just 3 months earlier. On that August night, Japanese cruisers had approached an Allied screening force and achieved complete surprise. Within minutes, 4 heavy cruisers had been sent to the bottom, over 1,000 Allied sailors perished, and Japanese forces withdrew, having suffered minimal damage. The victory seemed to confirm everything Japanese naval doctrine promised about night combat superiority. But something had changed in the waters around Guadalcanal. Reports filtering back from recent engagements contained disturbing anomalies. Ships reported being engaged by American vessels in conditions where visual acquisition should have been impossible. Captain Katsuo Abe of the destroyer Akatsuki had submitted a combat report describing how American destroyers had opened fire with remarkable accuracy despite heavy rain and complete darkness. His superiors had dismissed the report, attributing the incident to chance or perhaps skilled American lookouts who had grown accustomed to local conditions. Aboard the American destroyer USS Fletcher, positioned 15 kilometers northwest of Yamamoto's cruiser, a very different scene was unfolding. Radar operator second class Thomas Riley sat before a circular cathode ray tube, watching green phosphorescent blips paint across the screen with each sweep of the antenna. The SC Air Search radar had detected the approaching Japanese formation almost 30 minutes earlier, and now the SG Surface Search radar was providing remarkably precise information about enemy position, course, and speed. Lieutenant Robert Hagan stood behind Riley, calling out ranges and bearings to the bridge. The radar showed 13 distinct contacts approaching in a column formation, typical of Japanese night attack tactics. The lead vessels appeared to be destroyers, followed by what radar signatures suggested were heavy cruisers. Hagen could determine not only their position, but calculate their speed based on successive radar sweeps. The Japanese formation was advancing at approximately 26 knots, likely planning to round the northern tip of Guadalcanal, before sweeping south to bombard American positions at Henderson Field. The contrast between the two fleets could not have been more stark. Japanese lookouts peered desperately into rain and darkness, seeing nothing but occasionally catching the scent of diesel exhaust on the wind. American radar operators tracked every vessel in the enemy formation with precision that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The Americans knew exactly where their opponents were, how fast they were moving, and could predict with reasonable accuracy where they would be in 5 or 10 minutes. The Japanese had no idea American ships were even present. Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan, commanding the American task force from the heavy cruiser San Francisco, faced a difficult decision. His force consisted of 5 cruisers and 8 destroyers, a roughly equivalent match for the approaching Japanese formation. However, American crews were still mastering radar-directed gunnery techniques. The technology was so new that many officers remained skeptical of its effectiveness. Callahan himself had expressed reservations in recent staff meetings, preferring to rely on visual confirmation before opening fire. But tonight's conditions made visual acquisition nearly impossible. Rain squalls reduced visibility to less than 500 meters in most directions. Without radar, the Americans would have been as blind as their Japanese counterparts. Fire Control Officer Lieutenant James Morrison aboard the destroyer. Cushing had been tracking the Japanese formation for 23 minutes. He had calculated firing solutions for the lead enemy vessels. His data derived entirely from radar information fed into mechanical computers that adjusted for range, bearing, target speed, and even the ballistic characteristics of different ammunition types. At 11:48, with Japanese vessels now within 12,000 meters, Callahan gave the order to commence firing. What happened next would haunt Japanese survivors for the remainder of their lives. Commander Yamamoto was reviewing weather reports when the night suddenly exploded with light. Star shells burst high above his formation, illuminating the Japanese column in harsh white radiance. Before he could process this development, the sound of heavy gunfire rolled across the water. Seconds later, massive geysers erupted around the Kinugasa as shells impacted the sea. The Americans were firing, but from where? No ships were visible, no muzzle flashes betrayed enemy positions, yet somehow with impossible accuracy, shells were landing dangerously close to Japanese vessels. The first salvo straddled the destroyer Akatsuki, with shells landing both port and starboard. The second salvo achieved direct hits. 5-inch rounds slammed into her superstructure, detonating magazines and setting fuel stores ablaze. Within 90 seconds of the first American shot, Akatsuki was a burning wreck, her crew abandoning ship as secondary explosions tore through her hull. Lieutenant Commander Hara, watching from the Shigure, could barely comprehend what was happening. American destroyers were maintaining accurate fire despite visibility that made it impossible to see even nearby vessels in his own formation. Shells arrived with mechanical precision, walking up and down the Japanese column as American fire control systems adjusted based on radar-observed splashes. It was as if the Americans could see through the darkness and rain, as if they possessed some supernatural ability to track targets invisible to human eyes. Japanese vessels began returning fire, but without clear targets, their gunnery was largely ineffective. Lookouts called out bearing estimates based on muzzle flashes, but by the time Japanese guns could train on those positions, American ships had already maneuvered to new locations. The Imperial Japanese Navy's vaunted night fighting doctrine required visual acquisition of enemy vessels. When that became impossible, their entire tactical system collapsed. The heavy cruiser Chokai, flagship of the Japanese formation, attempted to coordinate a response. Vice Admiral Hiroaki Abe ordered his formation to execute a starboard turn, hoping to close range and bring torpedo tubes to bear. This maneuver might have been effective against opponents relying on visual targeting. Against radar-directed fire, it merely ensured that Japanese vessels steamed directly into increasingly accurate American salvos. Aboard the USS Fletcher, radar operator Riley called out the Japanese turn with impressive precision. The surface search radar showed the enemy formation beginning to pivot, individual vessels clearly distinguishable on his scope. Lieutenant Hagen quickly calculated the new bearing and passed updated information to the bridge. American destroyers adjusted their fire accordingly, their shells continuing to find targets despite the tactical maneuver. The technological disparity went beyond just detection. American vessels were equipped with Mark 37 gun directors, electromechanical systems that incorporated radar ranging data directly into fire control calculations. These devices could track targets, calculate lead angles accounting for both own ship and target motion, and automatically adjust for factors like wind speed and barometric pressure. A skilled operator could maintain accurate fire on targets completely invisible to the human eye. Japanese forces possessed no equivalent technology. Their fire control systems, while sophisticated for their era, relied fundamentally on optical rangefinders. These instruments required clear visibility of the target and became essentially useless in conditions like those present that night. Japanese gunners were reduced to firing at muzzle flashes and hoping for lucky hits, while American crews enjoyed continuous, precise tracking information. The battle devolved into a chaotic melee as formations intermixed and the range closed to point-blank distances. At such close quarters, radar advantage diminished somewhat, and Japanese training in close-quarters combat became more relevant. The destroyer Laffey found herself surrounded by Japanese vessels and fought desperately, her guns firing in local control as targets appeared suddenly from the rain and darkness. She would not survive the night, succumbing to overwhelming fire from multiple opponents, but her crew had inflicted significant damage before being overwhelmed. Commander Yamamoto, still struggling to understand how American forces were achieving such accurate fire, ordered the Kinugasa to launch illumination rounds. As flares drifted slowly downward on parachutes, the full scope of the American formation became visible for the first time. What Japanese lookouts saw shocked them. American vessels were positioned with geometric precision, maintaining formation spacing that should have been impossible in such conditions. They moved with coordination that suggested some means of communication and position awareness beyond anything Japanese forces possessed. The illumination proved costly for the Kinugasa. American radar had been tracking her throughout the engagement, and the moment she became visible, concentrated fire from 3 American destroyers focused on her position. The first salvo damaged her forward turret, the second penetrated her engine room, and the third started uncontrollable fires amidships. Within minutes, she was dead in the water, listing heavily to port as her crew fought to save their ship. Lieutenant Sato Takeshi, an engineering officer aboard the Kinugasa, would later describe the terrifying precision of American gunnery in his official report. He noted that shells seemed to arrive in clusters, with multiple ships firing at his vessel simultaneously. The coordination suggested centralized fire control, or at minimum very effective communication between American vessels. What he could not have known was that American ships were indeed coordinating their fire using radio voice communication, another technological advantage that Japanese forces lacked. While Japanese vessels relied primarily on signal lamps and flag hoists for intership communication, American commanders could coordinate complex maneuvers and concentrate fire simply by speaking into radio handsets. The engagement continued for another 73 minutes, a confused and brutal affair that saw vessels from both sides heavily damaged. When Japanese forces finally withdrew toward the north, leaving behind burning wrecks and hundreds of sailors struggling in oil-slicked waters, Commander Yamamoto found himself confronting an uncomfortable truth. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered a decisive defeat, not through any failure of courage or skill, but because their opponents possessed technological capabilities that rendered traditional night-fighting tactics obsolete. In the days following the battle, Japanese naval intelligence officers interviewed every surviving officer who had participated in the engagement. The reports they compiled made for disturbing reading. Multiple commanders described American vessels opening accurate fire at ranges and in conditions where visual acquisition was impossible. Several specifically mentioned the eerie precision of American gunnery, shells arriving in tight patterns that suggested mechanical calculation rather than human estimation. Captain Toshikazu Omae, assigned to analyze the engagement for Combined Fleet Headquarters, initially suspected that American forces had been guided by submarines equipped with powerful searchlights or perhaps by aircraft flying above the weather. Both theories were quickly discarded as impractical. The truth, when it finally became clear, was far more unsettling. American vessels possessed some form of electronic detection apparatus that could locate ships through darkness, rain, and even smoke screens. Japanese technical intelligence had been aware of Allied radar development, but had significantly underestimated its capabilities. Their own radar programs had focused primarily on aircraft detection, with naval applications considered secondary. The idea that radar could be sufficiently accurate and reliable for gunnery fire control seemed implausible to many Japanese engineers. The sets required were believed to be too large, too heavy, and too temperamental for effective shipboard use. The evidence from Guadalcanal suggested these assumptions were catastrophically wrong. Lieutenant Commander Hara, recuperating from minor injuries sustained during the engagement, spent hours discussing the battle with fellow officers. The consensus was unanimous. American forces had possessed some means of seeing Japanese vessels when Japanese lookouts could see nothing. The implications were profound and deeply troubling. If Americans could engage effectively in conditions where Japanese forces were essentially blind, then one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's core advantages had been completely negated. What made the situation even more concerning was the realization that this was not a fluke or isolated incident. As intelligence officers compiled reports from other recent engagements, a pattern emerged. American vessels were consistently achieving first salvo accuracy that traditional fire control methods could not explain. They were detecting Japanese formations at ranges that exceeded the capabilities of even the best-trained lookouts. They were maneuvering with coordination that suggested real-time position awareness of both friendly and enemy vessels. The industrial implications were equally sobering. If American forces were equipping their vessels with sophisticated electronic detection equipment as standard installations, it suggested a level of industrial capacity and technical sophistication that exceeded even pessimistic Japanese estimates. Radar sets required precision manufacturing, specialized components, and extensive testing. To produce them in quantities sufficient for fleet-wide deployment implied production capabilities far beyond what Japanese industry could match. Commander Yamamoto, assigned to write a detailed after-action report while his ship underwent repairs, struggled to find words that would adequately convey what he had witnessed. How did one explain to admirals trained in traditional naval tactics that an invisible technology had fundamentally altered the nature of sea combat? How did one communicate that courage, training, and tactical skill might no longer be sufficient to secure victory against opponents who possessed superior technology? His report, when finally submitted, made for grim reading. Yamamoto estimated that American radar provided at minimum a 3-to-1 advantage in night engagements, possibly greater depending on weather conditions. He recommended urgent development of Japanese countermeasures and noted that until such systems became available, night combat operations against American forces should be approached with extreme caution. Some officers in Tokyo dismissed his assessment as defeatist. Those who had witnessed similar engagements off Guadalcanal knew he was understating the problem. The technological gap extended beyond just radar. American forces were also benefiting from improved fire control computers, better quality optics, more reliable radio communications, and superior damage control training. Each advantage individually might be modest, but combined, they created a cumulative effect that gave American forces overwhelming superiority in specific combat scenarios. Japanese efforts to develop equivalent capabilities faced numerous obstacles. Domestic radar programs were fragmented across multiple services and agencies, with little coordination and frequent duplication of effort. Manufacturing capacity was limited, with critical components often requiring handcrafting by skilled technicians. Testing facilities were inadequate, and there was insufficient understanding of the theoretical principles underlying radar technology. Even when Japanese engineers successfully developed functional radar sets, Production remained limited and installations were often unreliable. By early 1943, American destroyer forces operating around Guadalcanal had refined their radar-directed gunnery techniques to a remarkable degree. New tactics emphasized rapid concentration of fire, with multiple vessels engaging single targets based on radar tracking information. This approach proved devastatingly effective against Japanese formations, still relying on visual fire control. The psychological impact on Japanese naval personnel was significant. Officers and sailors who had entered the conflict confident in their superior night-fighting abilities now approached nocturnal engagements with trepidation. The knowledge that enemy vessels could track and engage them without being visible eroded morale and led to increasingly cautious tactical decisions. Japanese commanders began avoiding night combat when possible, a dramatic reversal from the aggressive nocturnal tactics employed earlier in the conflict. Lieutenant Takeshi, the engineering officer from the Kinugasa, was eventually transferred to a technical evaluation unit tasked with examining captured American radar equipment. His first close examination of an American SG surface search radar set left him stunned. The device was compact, relatively lightweight, and appeared to be mass-produced using standardized components. It bore all the hallmarks of mature industrial design, suggesting that American engineers had solved numerous technical problems that Japanese developers were still grappling with. What impressed Takeshi most was the reliability of American equipment. Captured radar sets, even after sustaining combat damage, could often be restored to operation with minimal repairs. This contrasted sharply with Japanese electronic equipment, which frequently required specialized maintenance and was prone to failure under combat conditions. The implication was clear. American industry had not just developed radar technology, they had perfected it to the point where it could be deployed reliably throughout the fleet. The strategic consequences of American radar superiority became increasingly apparent as the conflict progressed. In engagement after engagement, American forces demonstrated an ability to detect, track, and engage Japanese vessels in conditions where traditional visual methods were ineffective. This advantage proved particularly decisive in the confined waters around Pacific Islands, where night combat was frequent and conditions often reduced visibility. Japanese naval leadership struggled to adapt to this new reality. Traditional tactical doctrines had to be completely reconsidered. The emphasis on night combat training, which had consumed enormous resources over more than a decade, suddenly seemed misplaced. New approaches were needed, but developing them would take time that Japanese forces did not have. Some innovative Japanese commanders attempted to develop countermeasures. One approach involved using extensive smoke screens to confuse American radar, with mixed results. Another tactic emphasized high-speed approaches designed to minimize the time American fire control systems had to calculate firing solutions. Neither approach proved consistently effective against American forces that were rapidly improving their own tactics and techniques. The radar technology gap also influenced broader strategic decisions. Japanese naval planners, recognizing that they could no longer count on achieving surprise in night attacks, began favoring different operational approaches. This shift contributed to changes in overall strategy that would have far-reaching implications for the conduct of operations throughout the Pacific Theater. Commander Yamamoto, eventually promoted and assigned to a staff position with the combined fleet, spent considerable time analyzing American industrial capabilities. His research revealed a sobering picture. American shipyards were producing vessels at rates that Japanese yards could not hope to match. Moreover, these ships were being equipped with radar and fire control systems as standard installations, not as special modifications. The industrial advantage that American forces enjoyed was not merely quantitative but qualitative as well. By late 1943, Japanese naval intelligence had compiled extensive reports on American radar capabilities. These documents, circulated among senior officers, painted a picture of technological and industrial superiority that many found difficult to accept. The Imperial Japanese Navy had entered the conflict believing in the superiority of its personnel, tactics, and equipment. Now, less than 2 years into the fighting, that confidence had been severely shaken. The human cost of the technological disparity was staggering. Japanese sailors continued fighting with tremendous courage, despite knowing they faced opponents who could see them when they remained blind. Vessels went into combat understanding that American radar would likely detect them first, track them continuously, and guide accurate fire onto their positions. The psychological burden of fighting under such conditions was immense. American radar operators, meanwhile, grew increasingly skilled at interpreting their displays and extracting maximum tactical value from the information available to them. Radar operator Riley, who had tracked the Japanese formation that November night off Guadalcanal, became an instructor, training new operators in the techniques he had developed through practical experience. His students learned to distinguish between ship types based on radar signatures, estimate target speeds from successive sweeps, and recognize tactical maneuvers from changes in formation patterns. The technological revolution that radar represented extended far beyond individual engagements. It fundamentally altered the nature of naval combat, shifting advantage toward forces that possessed superior electronics and industrial capacity. Traditional measures of naval power, such as numbers of battleships or the speed and armament of cruisers, became less important than technological capabilities like radar, fire control computers, and reliable radio communications. Japanese officers who had witnessed American radar capabilities firsthand often found their reports met with skepticism from superiors who had not experienced modern radar-directed combat. This disconnect between frontline realities and rear echelon understanding complicated efforts to develop effective responses. By the time Japanese leadership fully appreciated the magnitude of American technological advantages, the industrial and technical gap had widened to the point where catching up was no longer feasible. The battle off Guadalcanal that November night represented a turning point in naval warfare. It demonstrated conclusively that electronic technology could provide decisive tactical advantages and that traditional approaches to naval combat were becoming obsolete. The Japanese officers who witnessed American destroyers firing with impossible accuracy in total darkness returned with knowledge that would reshape their navy's approach to combat. Unfortunately for Japanese forces, the realization came too late to alter the fundamental trajectory of the naval conflict in the Pacific. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Do not forget to subscribe for more untold stories from the Second World War, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.